session, which will run till around 11:30. And can I start by thanking our witnesses who've taken the time to prepare for the session today and to come in and to talk to us, and for your written submissions as well. It's been incredibly helpful in the work that we've done so far. But this is our first oral evidence session for our inquiry into fathers in the workplace. We've got a lot to go through, as you can imagine. So I will immediately go to some questioning from Jess.
Thank you very much. We hear a lot nowadays that fathers want to do more and want more support in the workplace in order to fulfil their caring responsibilities. I just wonder if people can outline the actual evidence that substantiates that. I suppose, Sarah, it's your area of expertise.
Sarah Jackson, I'm the Chief Executive of Working Families. We have three sources of evidence. One is the annual survey that we do with working parents, which is called the Modern Families Index. The second is a benchmark that we do every year with our employer members. And the third are the calls that we take on our free legal advice service for parents and carers. So if I start with the Modern Families Index, we're now done 4 indexes. And what we've seen over the last 4 years is a steadily increasing picture of fathers who want more. They want to be more active as fathers. And they're under a real time squeeze because they're not getting the balance and the flexibility that they want from their employers. The picture is that because this is a survey just of working parents, we're seeing about a 50-50 split between families where there are both parents working full-time and families where one is full-time, one is part-time, or you've got a lone parent family. Looking at the fathers, we've seen a steadily increasing number who say that they think about childcare before they would take on a promotion or a new job. So we're now at 7 in 10 fathers think childcare before changing what they're doing. And 50% of the fathers are saying, actually, I would like to downshift, I'd like to have an easier job, less pressure, I would think about taking a pay cut. And I think what we're also seeing is far more engagement. I was contrasting it with a study we did about 10 years ago called Daddy's Home, we called it a life guide for fathers. And we tried to find fathers who were engaged at home by going to the school gate to do school gate interviews. And it was quite hard. Whereas now, the index fathers, a lot of them are dropping off in the morning. More drop off in the morning than the mothers do. More mothers pick up in the afternoon than the fathers do. So there's a real engagement that wasn't there before. And you're particularly seeing it around with when you're looking at younger fathers, they absolutely don't have the role that they want. There's an expectation among younger couples that there will be equality at home and equality at work. So he's going to be an active father, she's going to be active in the workforce. They're not getting that. They blame their employer. They feel disengaged and unhappy. They feel unable to talk about their responsibilities at work. And this goes pretty evenly, whether they've got flexible working or not. So I think one of the important things we need to understand is flexible working itself is not necessarily an answer. It's a useful tool, but we're talking about workplace culture. Moving on to the benchmark of our employer members, what we've seen over the last several years is the gap is closing. If you think that all the flexible working and family support stuff, if you like, was introduced in the 80s, it was driven by getting women back into work. So it's not surprising that employers have favoured policies that support mothers, and therefore it's not surprising that policies are perceived as being for mothers, and more specifically for mothers of young children. So what we're seeing, though, in the benchmark, and the benchmark is, of course, employers who take this seriously and want to be good at it, is a closing of the gap, so that when you're looking at leave, enhanced pay, training, coaching, support networks, it used to be just for the women. Now almost as many have those things for men as have for women. But when you then go to the helpline, you see that men are, if you like, suffering from the assumptions, the cultural assumptions and expectations which we see in the benchmark, that when men ask for flexible working, they're less likely to find it an easy ask, because the employer is basically saying, well, there must be a woman at home somewhere to look after your children.
In this index and this data, is what the range of working parents?
Yeah.
Is it across the board in every?
Across the UK. We last year we.
No, I mean in
income, right.
in income.
It tends towards the better off. Mm-hmm. Because it's an online survey.
Is there any particular attitudinal studies or evidence from other groups that anyone can talk to that is from, you know, I don't want to say low paid, normal paid groups in the UK and their attitude, their wants and or requests, evidence of changing patterns in the workplace?
Do you want to talk first? I can pick up.
Yeah, sure, I can do. We talked a bit about this in our submission. I'm Edward Davies from the Centre for Social Justice. Essentially, I think one of the things we found is that the debate generally tends to skew, and I think I am guilty of this as much as...
Don't feel guilty.
Thank you. That we can tend to think about working in too much in terms of quite sort of well-paid office jobs and flexible working and going home with a laptop and who can fill in for who and things like that. Yeah. Whereas for actually most normal people, that's not how it works. It's about shift work. It's, you know, if I'm a cab driver in Derbyshire, you know, I don't get flexible working. And there's less specific research on that, and there's less policy focus on that. And I think one of the things that we recommend in our submission is simply that there is more of a focus on that, because that's where you can make the greater difference. And the problem is when we talk about some of the things that have gone on, frankly, they benefit me, and I don't really need it. Whereas if we can really...
Guilt.
Sorry. Yeah. But there are guys that need it an awful lot more, and they don't get as much focus in research.
I think that what I'm asking is there a demand...
Yeah.
What works for people?
Yeah.
We'll come on to later, but more about the demand in every area and the evidence that fathers are changing their workforce. So a taxi driver and sort of person on a shift work could say, well, I'm going to work 10 at night till 3 in the morning, pick my kids up from school, go to work. You know, actually there is a level of flexibility in that sort of way of working. But is there any evidence that that is happening or that it is wanted?
Yeah, so I mean, some of the polling we've done around this actually was specifically on things like antenatal classes, was that high-earning dads did them a lot more than lower-earning dads, but actually lower-earning dads benefited from them a lot more. And so you have this situation where there is stuff out there that simply isn't benefiting those that need it, but when they get it, they benefit more from it. So I think the polling stat we have is 71% of fathers with a household income over 70,000 went on some kind of antenatal class. Under 20,000, it's only 30%. Whereas actually, when you see what benefit they got from it, it's the guys under 20,000 who benefit an awful lot more from it. And so you have this defined benefit.
I mean, there are so many explanations for that as to how young men, and particularly young fathers in disadvantaged groups, are treated when they go, or feel that they're being treated when they go to those sorts of classes. But any review of the literature shows you that fathers across all social classes and age groups talk about being there, and that's a really dominant discourse that is a change, and it's a generational shift that we're seeing. So there's the intention to be there. Whether that translates into practice is really dependent on all sorts of things like income. I mean, can you afford to? How, you know, are you on a 0 hours contract and possibly going to fear of losing job or whatever? If you actually try to translate that into practice, sounds like we might come to more of that later in terms of what works, but there is a shift in the discourse and the expectation and language that all fathers, I would say, and we find this across the literature, it's really a recurrent theme. Being there is something that fathers intend and want to do.
Could I add a very different type of evidence? Because you asked the question, is there demand? I recommend the work of Professor Peter Moss, who is in London and has done work internationally on leave uptake systems. And there's a striking feature that suggests there is demand in the rate of change when a policy is changed. So I'll give you 3 examples. In Quebec, they introduced leave for fathers, parental leave for fathers. And the uptake went from 22%, there was already leave in 2004, but by 2006 it was 69%. So that's in Iceland, they introduced changes in 2000, and the uptake of the leave went up to 95%. I mean, very generous things, obviously. In Germany, they made changes in 2007, and the leave went up from 3.3 to 29.3 in 5 years. So the change is very rapid when the leave is available, and I interpret that as evidence that there's latent demand, which is frustrated, if you like, and it's like taking a lid off. You take the lid off, give people choice, expanded choices, and they choose differently very, very quickly.
And so while policies in this country are not, I mean, they're getting to have similarities, is there any evidence about how this desire to be there, this changes and suggestions to employers, is there any evidence about how that might have been received by those employers, and whether it's being made possible by, and again, taking into account that I know that EY would allow you to do it, but with a gas engineer?
If you look at the people who call our helpline, so we take about 3,000 calls a year. If you strip out the 50% that are about maternity, okay, well then, we're crunching down. About 25% of the calls are about men and about fatherhood. And about a quarter of those are about flexible working in the sense of either difficulties with requesting it or difficulties around imposed changes to contract. And it's evident, I think, that first of all, fathers don't really know what their rights are in that space. When they do know, they find it very difficult to access those rights. And there is also quite clearly coming through a picture of men saying, the women in my workforce, if I was a woman and I said I needed to be at the hospital this afternoon, some slack would be cut, but because I'm a man, it's not. So there is an attitudinal blocker, and the men who are calling our helpline are not at EY; they are ordinary working men. So there is definitely there is demand, and there is a demand that's being frustrated.
So there is evidence that employers are potentially treating mothers different to fathers.
Yes,
with a negative effect to fathers.
Yes, and I think that's for two reasons. One is because you've got 30 years' worth of a business case, which is based in getting women back into the workforce, and it's also the way that the discrimination laws work, that employers look at a woman and they're frightened, whereas they look at a man and they're not.
Is there any examples of good employers in this space who, not EY, who are, sort of looking at flexibility in? There's there is examples.
So I feel like I'm answering all the questions. I'm sorry, but I'm sure we'll get to other ones. But we run awards in the UK and also in Scotland through Family Friendly Working Scotland, that's a partnership between us and some charities in Scotland. A good example. What's interesting in Scotland is that it is beyond the EYs. So, for example, West Dunbartonshire Council, a very ordinary local authority in a fairly deprived part of Scotland, has really invested in their fathers. Looking very much at communication, how to identify fathers, how to make sure that they're applying for childcare vouchers, that they understand the rights that they've got, for example. We're also seeing SMEs in Scotland picking up the baton, and very little is known about SMEs and their practice around fatherhood. But we had a good example last week, a small marketing company called Pursuit Marketing, who are the best SME for working families in Scotland, were so inspired by hearing about what the good employers around fathers were doing, is that they have introduced 4 weeks of paid paternity leave, full pay, as of April the 1st. So there are pockets of good practice, and there are exemplar organisations.
And what about the union? Do you feel there's been any push from any unions around this area of work?
In terms of the work the TUC is doing on precarious work, yes. I think it is, I think one of the things I'm sure we'll come on to talk about this morning is contractual, whether you're an employee or a worker or an agency worker, and men really suffer.
But with regard to attitudinal issues at work, so let's say your gas engineers, your lift fitters, your people working in male-dominated workforces, they have reps who are like them. I wonder if there is any attitudinal evidence from that group of people, because you'd go to, and if they are fighting for it from their employers, if this is a priority, because when it comes to pay, that is, pay changes, or whether we're going to have electronic things in the cabs of the vans and things, these things get brought up and get pushed, and it shows an attitude towards those things of the workforce. I wonder if some of the unions who have people within those workforces that are very male-dominated wouldn't have an insight into some of the attitudes. And I mean, I've never been approached to say, all the people at JLR are pushing for really good parents' rights.
I would
there
say
is no evidence.
The evidence we have from the helpline is that union reps are very good on pay, health and safety, those sorts of things. But for flexible working, whether for men or for women, it's partly about what they've got the bandwidth to deal with, I think. But I think it would be very interesting to talk to the unions about how to support fathers better. So
do you all agree that there's more need for data and evidence gathering in this area?
Yeah, I think there's evidence in smaller scale qualitative studies about the difficulty in perhaps a male-dominated environment to be the one to ask, to risk being seen as perhaps a bit effeminate in some way. I mean, although there's the discourse of being there, actually, practicing that, actually being able to do that, if it involves you making a claim that is going to make you look different to the other guys around you. Certainly in my own research, which is small-scale qualitative research, some of the fathers spoke about their intentions to share caring equally with their partners. I've interviewed over time, so I've seen people through before the birth of their first child. And the intentions to share equally didn't involve changing work patterns particularly, because everyone makes an assumption that childcare is so easy, can be squeezed into corners of the day. It's a really important misunderstanding. It's one of the most important findings, I think, is everyone thinks this small baby will come home from the hospital, will occupy that amount of space for until it grows up and leaves home. And no one can prepare mothers or fathers for the enormity of the change. And it's very easy then, it's a very difficult time to be making claims on employers for rights and all sorts of things if you're the bloke in that situation. And actually, it's the easiest thing to do, as everyone is shell-shocked from getting on with the new baby, to just all revert to practices that don't require a bit of pushing. So we have to really try to enable, and actually I think make fathers take up, I think we'll come to this, but take up leave. If we're serious about men being involved, that's the only way to get men involved, because
I agree with that.
Mothers and fathers don't make choices about who takes leave from a level playing field. It's gendered, it's historically unequal, it's all of those things. If we're really serious, we have to say this is father's leave. And men will benefit in all sorts of ways from that, and many men want that. But it does make it possible then for the fathers who perhaps haven't realised they want it, or find it difficult to try to ask and request that. So it is complicated, but it does start from everyone's assumption that caring for a baby is the easiest thing in the world, because it's what women do, and that is where we start at the wrong place, basically.
Right. Tracy?
Sarah, it's the findings from the Modern Families Index. You refer to the fatherhood penalty, and you've been talking about the helpline and that you've had some feedback from fathers themselves, but is it broader than that? What does it mean, the fatherhood penalty?
I think what it means is we've become very accustomed to the motherhood penalty. We know that women make compromises in their work or their career to accommodate family life, and that translates over a lifetime in the workplace into a significant financial loss to the family, possibly to the woman if the couple relationship breaks up, and so she's facing a poorer or impoverished pensioner lifetime. And it also, there is an obvious cost to business, because talent is walking out the door. What we're beginning to see in the index, and the reason that we've called it a fatherhood penalty, is that young fathers are beginning to ask the same questions and express the same doubts about their future at work that women have already been doing for 30 years. I don't think that it is super evident yet, although I think there are two things you can point to. Some of the work that we do with our employers when we're looking at employee engagement shows that it's the women who are the engaged members of the workforce, not the men. And I think that's because women make their compromises, they make their peace with what they're doing, and they buckle down, and they've decided what works for them. Whereas what we're seeing is a picture of men generally, and young men in particular, feeling dissatisfied but being constrained by the breadwinner expectation. They feel they've got to stick where they are. We also see it increasingly with organisations who are saying it's difficult to get their men to step up to be partner or to be the senior manager because it's going to take too much time. Women, I think, have long understood that there are two currencies that are necessary for family life. One is money, obviously, and the other is time. And so they have been getting the balance between time and money. Men are now beginning to understand that time is an equally important currency for the health of your family and yourself. And so I think what we're beginning to see is men saying we're going to favour time over money, and that I think is a significant risk for UK PLC. Although it's potentially a significant benefit for family life if it does translate into a younger generation of men saying we're going to take the hit and we're going to share more equally at home and at work.
And could I broaden that out to the rest of the committee, what you think is the fatherhood penalty?
Yeah, I know what it is because I've had it. If a father does what men mothers do, which is to step out of the full-time ladder to the top, and you work part-time or you start working from home, which is what I did. I gave up work when my first daughter was born in order to work from home. I did very well at working from home, and that was great fun. However, my income isn't anything like it would have been had I stayed where I was. So I think it's often called the motherhood penalty, but what is... And then that was contrasted with the fatherhood bonus. You've probably heard of that from coming over. Yeah. The daddy bonus, that was an idea that came over from the United States. But actually that's a bit of a myth, because what that is that's what happens when men go into intensive work because their partners have stepped out. So they have to earn more for the family, and so that their income goes up. It's not a benefit, it's actually rather good for the family, to be honest, if they're earning more. But if the man chooses to do what the woman does, then the man gets the same experience, which is that you pay for it. Simply you pay for it. You get less money, you earn less money, you have a smaller pension. It's what happens. So that's what I would call a fatherhood penalty.
And one thing I'd add to that is, so completely separately from this, we've done work at the CSJ on changing attitudes to business, and something we found is that millennials, particularly coming through, will now pick an employer based a bit more on their social responsibility, their social attitude, and how they are as an employer. And that's been a real shift over a generation. And so we are seeing much more of dads looking at a business and saying, will they give me flexibility? And that's going to be a factor. The other thing I'd slightly say is that there is definitely a financial penalty in being more present as a father. They all talk about the time that they spend being a father, taking them, work, taking away from being a father. But actually thinking of it in big national, United Kingdom PLC terms, actually this is a good investment. So if you are a present father, your child is 25% more likely to escape poverty. So in the long term, this is an investment in UK PLC. This is a good thing. Similarly to you, I have taken jobs which have made me more available at home, where I have worked from home for several years. But that investment, I see it as both a financial and a relational investment in my kids. And I think people are starting to see that. And I think that's probably quite an important thing to bear in mind, that it is actually a national financial investment, because your kids will do better as a result.
And Professor Miller, do you see absolute evidence that these negative experiences are attributable to discrimination?
Actually, I think you might be more able to answer that. I'm certainly from my own research, see, as I said earlier, fathers feeling I mean, it's a really tricky terrain that we're talking about because of these gendered histories, I would call them, but because of men now experiencing, or some men experiencing, the motherhood penalty in that same way, and it comes back to much larger, broader issues about the fact that caring for children is invisible, undervalued. Not even, and we have a caring crisis in the UK, and that's going to continue, not just for kids, for older people. So this is something we really have to try and get right. Caring has to be valued, and men can care just like women can care for children or for other people. So in thinking about, I think of this as an equation. Sorry, I think I've probably got off the topic a little bit, in terms of an equation where we have, mothers and fathers and paid work and care in the home, which is also a form of work. And we need to get that equation right, and it doesn't work currently because it continues to disadvantage women. If men want to take it up, they are then suffering the same fatherhood penalty. So it's discriminating against them. And somehow this is more than just about shared parental leave. It's about a whole range of different policy mechanisms that need to work together and be joined up. So I think everyone currently is stressed out, feeling time poor. That does come out in the research, because they're making ad hoc childcare arrangements if they're trying to work. It is still usually the mother who is the one who balances or juggles. Everyone's juggling at some point, trying to get home to bath the kid at least, or be involved as a father. So it's in a bit of a mess at the moment, and I think very broadly, and I think that we don't want to go down the track of just incurring a fatherhood penalty because we've learned from the ways in which women have been discriminated against if they try to balance these things. But for me, it really starts from the fact we do not value caring, and it is invisible.
I would say that there is gender inequality in the workplace, and it plays out differently for men and women. So I don't see employers saying, I am choosing to treat this man differently because he's a father. Not consciously. So I don't see it as a big D legal discrimination issue. I do see it as a gender equality issue. I do see it as an inherent cultural issue. And there are ways that we can tackle it through the law. And there are ways that we can tackle it by changing our conversation publicly and by showing governmental leadership.
And just moving on, that the disadvantages, obviously you've talked about the diminished earnings, and you'd also see it as promotion prospects as well, that there isn't that.
Well, yes, I mean, you step off the ladder and you make your own way. I mean, I was, basically set up my own businesses and stuff like that. That's It's just more insecurity, I suppose. It's more different. It's a different way. I mean, I have to say though, in case my children are listening, I would not choose it differently for all the world. I did that because I chose it, and that was my privilege. A lot of people don't have the privilege of choosing. I did, and I took it. But I don't use my experience as something that's relevant to other people. I think there are a lot of people out there who suffer a lot because of it.
And so would you say that it would be good to think of paternity or parental status as a protected characteristic?
I don't think that paternity works as a protected characteristic. If you think that maternity is protected during pregnancy and for the protected period after childbirth, and so I've been tussling with this, and I can't see how you would create an equivalent paternity protected characteristic. What I'd be much more interested in talking about is some sort of protected characteristic that's about having care responsibilities, because that would capture men, women, same-sex couples, adopters, people caring for disabled children, people caring for elderly parents, people caring for terminally ill spouses. There are so many people who are not covered by discrimination law as it currently exists, and we could do so much better. And then a lot of the people who are calling our helpline, and indeed many of the women who have to fall back on indirect sex discrimination, the discrimination law is complicated and difficult. So if we could simplify by having a caring responsibility protected characteristic, I think it would help everyone.
Thank you.
Yes.
I mean, this is a recommendation that we do make in our submissions, that we do include paternity as a part of the Equalities Act. And I think the reason we think that is that actually there is a culture shift that's needed that is not happening at the moment. And we need to, that alone won't change a huge amount, but actually there is a raft of changes that are needed that says, you know, fatherhood is just really important. And a lot of the tension comes from work, too much time at work. And so the government has an opportunity to actually use the long arm of the law to say fatherhood is important. And we can sort of tussle about the detail of what is the best place to put it, but this seems to be a good area where employers would have to take notice and say, do you know what, we have to have a bit of respect for this whole dad thing because it seems to be a big deal in government. And so there will be a raft of things that governments can do to change culture, but this would be one that would send a really strong message to employers that this matters.
Just one more thing that, Sarah, you did say it's the way discrimination laws work. I wonder if you could expand on that.
In terms of, quite a lot of the people who call our helpline don't have that discrimination requires a comparator. So if you're a man in a workplace and you can point to a woman who has been given the flexible working or the leave that you don't have, then you have a comparator. But most often people don't, especially if you're looking at a male-dominated workforce. So if you have somebody who's who's working in an engineering business, for example, there probably isn't a female comparator. So he's got nowhere to go in terms of discrimination law. So that's why it doesn't work.
Interesting, thank you.
And just picking up on that, because you if I may, before I bring in Holly, you talked about gender inequality in the workplace, that it plays out differently. It isn't, so you don't feel that that's something that can be challenged with the present law, or that law could never really challenge that, because if you just said that maybe...
I think the present law could be improved. So there are a couple of straightforward things you could do. You could make sure that paternity leave and shared parental leave are a day one right for all fathers, because at the moment you have to be an employee, and you also, even as an employee, you have to have been employed for 26 weeks before 15 weeks before your baby is due, before you to be able to give notice to take 2 weeks paternity leave. So there's this huge inequality that fathers face in the workplace right at the start. So there's an equalisation there that should be made. I think we should also look at the flexible working law, because you'll know that hardly any flexible working, putting the fees aside, hardly any flexible working cases ever get to tribunal. And there are two reasons for that. One is that the tribunals can only look at the process. Has the employer followed the proper process? They can't look at whether there is really a business case for refusal. And the other thing is that the remedies are so low. The maximum remedy is 8 weeks' pay. So if you are a low-paid father, you are not going to gamble your job on 8 weeks' pay. And if you are an employer who doesn't really want to have to think about this, 8 weeks' pay is not much of a penalty to worry about. So the end result is that flexible working, it's been a fantastic piece of legislation. It has created a culture change, but I think it's got to the limits of its usefulness, particularly for fathers. So those are two simple legal changes I'd like to see made.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Holly.
Thank you very much, Chair. And if I can perhaps return to you, Professor Miller, because it relates to an answer given to one of Jess's earlier questions. I'm interested in the way that the evidence base, and we've heard that where there might be gaps in that, and is it sort of comprehensive enough that we can dig deeper into different social groups, different cultural groups, different community groups within that evidence base? And one area where we did touch on was young fathers in particular, and in relation to the prevalence of low-paid work. I'm mindful that the government's decision to set the threshold for the national living wage was 25, and so you would expect to see a prevalence of low-paid work under 25s. And given that part of the justification for that was this notion that young people were not productive enough on average, was one of the reasons given by one of the ministers at the time. Do you think that that manifests in more pressure, whether that's just expectation about how hard under 25s will be expected to work, as well as financial pressures for that particular group of people?
I mean, to go back to the evidence and what we've got and what we haven't got. I mean, there's some great work that's gone on at Leeds University on young fathers, and in other pockets of in the UK, looking at young fathers and involvement and commitment to fathering and fatherhood, and where and how and if work fits into that. So I think there's an evidence base of the type of data that doesn't get generalised, isn't designed to be generalisable because it's qualitative, it's much more in depth, but it really contributes to this larger scale styles of quantitative data that we have available. So we really need to be putting this all together. I think there's a lot out there. There are gaps too. So, sorry, is your question about, do I think that young fathers have... I mean, I do think that young fathers have a variety of demands on them where they're seen as young and irresponsible, particularly if they become a father at a young age, which historically would not have been the case because it would have been the norm. So we're identifying, if we look at patterns of when people have children. So we're just, this is just it's seen as abnormal in today's society. It wouldn't have been done, 80 years ago, whatever, if we look at age of first birth, and, those have gone up. So we identify young fathers, just as young mothers, as being problems in some way. I don't know if this is answering your answer, but again, we did a small amount of young father research at Oxford Brookes. Their lives were chaotic. That's the only way I can describe them. And this really coincided with research that was done at Leeds. We shared data where the young fathers who were in the studies, they had so many other people involved in their lives, service providers. The fatherhood was one identity that they had, and they were really going to hang on to that. And they really wanted to be the sort of dad they hadn't experienced in their own lives. And again, all of their intentions were there, but they were sort of flawed at the first hurdle of just as I said, in antenatal clinics, etc., being ignored. One guy spoke about the fact that he was actually spoken to, and this made him feel so great about his impending fatherhood as he was in the scan. But I think as a society we're incredibly discriminatory against anyone who falls outside of the norms of when we think things should be occurring. And as I say, historically we wouldn't have noticed these young fathers in the same way. Holly, I don't think that's answered your question.
Well, thank you. That's all been really helpful. I think what I'm just trying to dig a bit further on is whether you think the living wage threshold puts more pressure on young people, dads in particular, that they're uncomfortable because they feel that bit more vulnerable, given some of the justifications for why the threshold is set at 25?
I think that, if you have got, if you're earning a living wage, or if you're on a 0 hours contract, or if you're experiencing some sort of precarity in your employment, and according to social class, we've seen today in terms of the types of fathers who feel able to say at work, I'm going to take some leave, or request it even. That a young father would be disadvantaged, I think, in even feeling able to do that. And then if there's someone who are living, on a low wage where employment is precarious, all of those things will sort of confound the issue and make it very difficult to be making claims and requesting time, etc., to actually be the type of father that they're hoping to be. And generally it's a different father to the sort of father that they themselves feel that they've had, or fathering that they've had.
Okay, thank you.
Andrew.
Can I just clarify 2 points? Has any kind of demographic been done of the studies, and what data sets are you working within? Is it a wide-scale study in terms of different employment sectors? And secondly, what exactly are you referring to as low income? I'm not entirely clear, because obviously the average income in London is very different from the average income in Scotland. So can I just clarify those 2 points from whoever's got studies?
Mine are small-scale qualitative studies that you have to get ethics committees require that people opt into them. You can guess the sort of dads who opt into those sorts of studies to give their time, even though there was some diversity in there, but not anything that I would claim to be representative, more broadly representative.
On the helpline, we use £28,000 a year as a family income as our definition of low income, and about 60%, 65% of helpline callers fall within that category.
Yeah, I think in the polling we've done, we've tended to say under 20,000 for lower paid, and then the top band is over 70, and then we see around 40 as the middle, so that would be about where we go on there. But I do think, to the point of is there enough demographic data, I do think particularly in what we would call the lower normal income, there isn't enough breakdown of that to really know about that.
Angela, what's your line of questioning now?
So just coming on to the area, which I've lost.
Got too caught up with your data.
I mean, how effective do you think the current government policies are, including shared parental leave, and just why are so many fathers not taking up that right that they're entitled to? Anyone can jump in.
I mean, a policy change signals something. So shared parental leave is great that it was introduced. It signals a commitment to changing something. But actually how that translates, at the coalface in everyday lives, and that's the sort of research that I do. It's looking at the micro processes, if you like, in households. And the idea that, and I know Nick Clegg spoke about mothers and fathers having an equal choice, and sort of, it sort of conjured up this picture of, mums and dads having a really nice chat over a breakfast table at home, making a decision about how they'd, who'd work, who'd stay home, and all those things. It's much more complex than that, because people need money when a baby is born. Usually, because of the motherhood penalty, the woman doesn't earn as much. There are all sorts of financial reasons that it can make sense for the father to be the one who stays in work. Equally, looking after a child is really hard. It's hard work. The one thing that really came out in my studies was the fathers recognising for the first time ever the invisibility of caring, and they would talk about, I could work flat out all day at home with a kid, I could really, do all sorts of interesting things, and it doesn't count for anything out there. And men are, this is a generalisation, but used to their lives and identities and worker identities being rewarded outside of the home, in the workplace. So nothing, what goes on in the home is something, of course, it's a private sphere and all those things, but they sort of realised it didn't count for anything. It was really important work, but you don't get a pat on the back or promotion for being a really involved father and doing a great job with your kids. So it's not, it's difficult to make decisions in that sphere. And I know I made in my submission the case with Sweden, who introduced their some of their policies, 30 years ahead of us, basically, and had to go back and change it to make fathers take the leave, because that's the only way that you can sort of kick-start the cultural shift that has to go along with the policy change. And there'll be fathers who will really welcome it, and there will be some mothers who really don't like the idea, and there will be some fathers who think, oh my goodness, I've got to do that month, or whatever it is. It's not that everyone feels the same about this, but fathers should be involved in their children's lives. Women are workers, and they also want to forge identities in the workplace. And we have to make this equation work in a better way than it does currently.
Shall I say something? I mean, my first daughter was born in 1996, and ever since then I've been campaigning for shared leave entitlements. And it comes around every 5 years, and this is the next one. And I feel I've been spectacularly unsuccessful in all my efforts. I think the leave regime at the moment is terrible. That's my view. And the reason it is because it absolutely emphasises the idea that the caring role is the mother's. So all the leave is given to the mother, and it's her. She then gives the guy if she wants to, and that communicates a really unfortunate message, which is a foundation of gender inequality in our society, saying that the caring is the mother's role. And I've witnessed from the inside the intense politics that come into play when these issues are debated. And you have women's lobbies, mothers' lobbies, business lobbies. You have different parts of government, because the last time it all happened within the coalition government. So you had fighting within the coalition. And we keep the result keeps being this very traditional form and we don't move forward. We predicted with absolute confidence at the time that this new system would not work. We wrote it down because we knew that when in 5 years' time we could then say it and say, look, we said it then to prove it. We knew it wouldn't work because it doesn't meet the basic, it doesn't tick the boxes that we know need to be ticked for leave systems to work from the international perspective. And the three boxes, if you like, the three absolute requirements are: one, there needs to be leave, which is there is leave that's only for mothers, okay? And there needs to be the similar amount of leave for the fathers. We call it the daddy month, all the rest, as if it was different, but it's not. It's exactly what the mothers get, okay? So I don't like calling it the daddy month or calling it anything special at all. Simply, there's leave which only she can have and only he can have, and they should be in equal proportions. The second one is the pay. You have to take into account the fact that these are earning parents. They are not going to take leave. And I know that's unfortunate in the current economic conditions, but that is one of the boxes. And the third one, it sort of relates to what Tina Miller was saying. You are operating in an unlevel playing field with lots of assumptions. You have to promote the cultural change. You have to advertise the fact that, for example, in Scandinavian countries, they had advertising campaigns about men and babies, and they put it up on posters and things. You have to put it out there and be proactive and get behind it and believe in it. I don't quite want to go I wouldn't go as far as Tina in saying that we should force men to take it. I don't think.
What I mean is it should be available to all men, and there should be an expectation.
I think you, in the Scandinavian countries, you see that even if you just open up the choices will change hugely. We can then start worrying about, further changing it. But I think the availability of choice is quite enough for a very big change, certainly beyond. So I think the ultimate test of the current legislation is the very, very incredibly low take-up of fathers. I mean, it couldn't. You'd really have to. It's like you've tried to make it low. That is so low that is engineered to be low. That isn't a normal thing. We're forcing that situation, and we need to change the system and let people choose differently. So I'm sort of feel long in the tooth, and I'm sort of hoping that we'll get round to some success by the time I'm a grandparent.
Can I just add to that? Also, the word culture has come up quite a lot, and I'm slightly loath to use management speak before lunch, but there is that saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And it feels a lot of policy that goes on at the moment is about pulling a lever, pulling a strategy and hoping it does something without actually addressing culture. And actually that's a much bigger question, and it's going to require more than just let's pull this lever here and hope that happens. And it won't, it hasn't, it doesn't happen. There needs to be a much bigger piece of work that says this is about changing a culture, not a law.
And I think that's where you have to make partnership with employers. Because what employers can do is they can do the communication piece. They can say we're serious about this. With Family Friendly Working Scotland last year, we did focus groups with low-income parents, and it was very clear, fathers and mothers both, when they did know about flexible working, they thought it wasn't for them. They thought it was for the people in the office. So there's a very clear thing that employers can do. And when we look at shared parental leave, I agree with Duncan, the take-up has not been huge. But where it has been huge is in the NCT fathers. If you look online and you look at all the blogs, they work for City, they work for DWF, they work for the professional services, legal services. That is creating a culture change, but it's only happening because those big organisations have done massive advertising campaigns and said, take this leave, we mean it. So there is something really important about engaging the employer community to say it is important to us that whether you are a man or a woman, if you have care responsibilities, your life outside work is important to the way that you perform for us. And therefore, please, here is your flexible working right, here is your paternity leave, your maternity leave, your shared leave. Take it. We mean it. We're not going to discriminate against you.
The example that Scotland had the Year of the Dad last year in 2016 is something that the UK should also replicate to make that example and raise awareness and actually get people to take up the paternity leave.
Yeah.
That was a great campaign, and we were very jealous.
Yeah.
To what extent do you feel that fathers have enough financial support to enable them to fulfil their caring responsibilities, and what evidence is there that greater financial incentives would persuade more fathers to take care of their children?
I mean, I can say, 25% of the fathers who are calling us are worried about tax credits, universal credits, in-work benefits. So, families are struggling. Maternity pay, if you're on maternity leave, you are getting less than the national minimum wage at a time when your costs have gone up. It's not surprising that he stays at work, really, whatever his wage is. I think if you look at the Family and Childcare Trust submission, they talk about young fathers and how they feel under the cosh financially, that the support isn't there. When you looked at an independent right for fathers leave last year, we helped you calculate the cost of doing that. Leave will only get taken if it's paid, and that's why we see we casually say the EYs, but that's why we say in the big corporates, they pay maternity leave at full pay for up to 26 weeks in many cases. They're matching that for shared parental leave for their men. That makes it affordable. It also means that people come back to work. It's a good retention tool, but it is absolute evidence. And Duncan has talked about the evidence from other countries in terms of if you pay fathers to take leave, they can afford to do it.
Probably come on to that. So my last question for you is, what would be the most effective changes to the current policies, and what policies would you propose both for the employers and on mothers to redress this balance?
You start.
Well, I've talked about changes to paternity leave and notice. We have all talked about an independent right to paid leave. Day one rights for paternity and shared parental leave. We need a paternity allowance as we have a maternity allowance, because so many men are unable to take paid leave at all when their child is born. We need an independent right to paid leave at wage replacement levels. We've talked about flexible working and that the right to request needs to be strengthened. It would be really good if we could encourage, government can take the lead on this as a big public sector employer, look at flexibility by default, so that all jobs are reviewed for their potential for flexible working and advertised as such. Only if there's a real solid business case for it to be an inflexible job should it be advertised in that way. That would go some way to beginning to create a culture change and move flexible working away from being an accommodation for mothers and children. I think all of those things could make a huge change, and none of them are too difficult.
I think the other thing that we would like to see is actually a named individual minister with a responsibility for this at Cabinet Office, probably, because the thing you'll see as well is if you're trying to change culture, if you put someone responsible in DWP or in DFE, they're going to be siloed into what they do, whereas put someone right across the remit who can say, do you know what, I need to be in the Department of Health doing this as well. Antenatal classes are important. I know that Dad's reading with kids is a brilliant indicator of their GCSE outcome, so I need to be in the DFE. I know that half our prisoners don't have a father figure. I need to be in the Ministry of Justice. So having one person that can sit centrally and say, this is part of our culture as government, is that I can have a say on all these things and make sure that the policies that come out are father-friendly, are family-friendly. That would make a huge difference. And it's because it's not a specific policy as such. It's saying culturally, this needs to change on a really big scale. So, I'd have the Prime Minister or something, but I think realistically, the Cabinet Office is probably where that person would sit and will be given a remit across everything.
I think we've got a couple of supplementaries. Flick.
Yes, so I just want to go back a bit to what Duncan said some time ago about fathers taking time off work. And obviously there's a physical issue here where women, it takes time to get over childbirth, and then breastfeeding. Having breastfed all my 4 children to about a year old, I didn't really want my husband there, particularly during that first year. I had 4 and 5 years, so actually 5 years. But do you think it would be a good idea to be able to take that shared parental leave at a later date, so during the child's life rather than the first year, which it seems to be the pressure to be, take the time off in the first year rather than at other times?
Right, we get down to this is a key issue. Breastfeeding is a key issue. I'm glad you brought it up, because it sort of sits in the background and has done in all the debates about leave entitlements in the last 20 years. I think I put this in my written evidence that the thing that disrupts breastfeeding is full-time work, and particularly long hours full-time work. So that's the thing that we're trying to avoid. But the systems that we're talking about are doing precisely that. We're not encouraging that. Interestingly, counterintuitively perhaps, the global research on breastfeeding shows that the more that the fathers are engaged in the care of the baby, the more the breastfeeding there is. So it's not this idea that somehow if the man is at home, his mother's been pushed out and away from breastfeeding. It just doesn't work like that in families. What happens is if he's more involved and more engaged with the baby, and I could say a little bit more about why that happens, because there's a lot of science now that we understand. But basically, if he's there and he's more involved, he tends to be more caring and more attentive, and becomes more. And if he's well informed, and this is part of this sort of global thing of, if he's very informed about breastfeeding, he will support breastfeeding. Breastfeeding will go up. So there isn't a zero-sum game. It just isn't like that. And the idea that, no, we can't have men looking after babies who are less than 1 year old because it might disrupt breastfeeding is completely the opposite of what actually happens when they do. Breastfeeding is encouraged. And so I would say that if we're concerned about breastfeeding, the key to improving breastfeeding rates is information and education for families, particularly targeting fathers. And that will greatly enhance the rates. It's not about, this work flexibility we're talking about will not affect it significantly compared to that other strategy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, wouldn't it be useful to have that, shared parental leave, that they could take it at another time during the child's life rather than perhaps at the beginning?
You see,
is there any evidence to show that's a good idea or not?
No, you see, it doesn't. The science says the opposite. Over the last 5 years, or literally in the last year, they're publishing research on the biology and neurobiology of fatherhood. And the critical, and what happens is that basically when a man cuddles a baby, his hormones change, just like mother's hormones do, and his brain changes, his plastic brain, and his brain changes permanently. And the more he cares for the baby, the more his brain changes, okay? So it's a quantitative thing. So what that points to is the importance of the father-child cuddling. Let's call it that, it's bonding we call it, but it's actually the physical thing that triggers it. That the proximity of the father and baby is important from the beginning, actually from the first day. So if you organise society that the mother does the first year and then the men come in, two things happen. One, he hasn't connected with the baby in the same way as she has. Right? So he is not tuned in.
It's not working 24/7 though. There are, I would hope. You can work and be close to your baby. It's not, as you say, it's not. The way you said it, it's like you don't see the baby for the first year. And
exactly. But nevertheless,
like
the key is the father looking after the baby by himself. That's the key, because then two things happen. One, you get the bonding, you get the attunement, if you like, and two, you get the growth of competence and the growth of confidence that he can be a carer. And that's one thing I say to all new fathers. They sometimes, just occasionally ask, what's your advice? Very rarely. That's the one thing I say. Days alone with the baby. That changes.
A baby has to be breastfed.
Yes, the baby is breastfed. We breastfeed. But we breastfeed.
No. I know, but
we did both in my family. You see, we managed to combine breastfeeding, exclusive breastfeeding, with this system.
We also have quite low rates of breastfeeding in the UK, so it shouldn't drive policy. But it's sadly not everyone breastfeeds.
My question is just more about, we're accepting that one of the biggest issues is that men fall off that fiscal cliff, don't they, when they decide to take paternity leave. And in some countries it's 90%. And all sorts of countries have tried different models. I suppose my question is, what do you think would be the recommendation to the government, do you think would be a real engine for change if you decided a percentage of earnings?
Well, 90% is what women get for the first 6 weeks.
So equality.
Equality, absolutely.
Yeah.
Wage replacement.
Maybe you did answer this. When I was a bit concerned, Duncan, when you were saying that the idea of... but then you went on to say that fathers had to have it on their own, because I thought what you were suggesting was that mothers and fathers should stay off work together. And just sort of probing on what Flick was saying, the idea of... I don't think it was so much about the first year as parents taking leave following one another in order for it to be suitable for their working environment. But you sort of answered it by saying that they need to be on their own, because any sort of... I can totally see that it'd be lovely to have had 6 months off with my husband there the entire time. And, you know, I watched a lot of Grand Theft Auto when he was there. But the fact of the matter is that wouldn't be a policy thing that would help anyone go to work. So I just wanted to make sure that's not what you were suggesting, that parents took that leave as a solution, that both were given an equality of leave and that they could take it at the same... that they should take it at the same time.
Chair, I mean, I'd ask you the question about whether there should be that possibility. For example, if you have twins or a disabled child or something like that.
Well, I think that what we do know about shared parental leave tells us that couples like to have some time together. Now, this is still anecdotal because the research is not solid on shared parental leave, but what I'm picking up from the blogs and from talking to employer members is that couples who choose to use it, who can afford to use it, will take a few weeks tacked onto statutory paternity leave. So the couple together is choosing to spend 4 to 6 weeks to establish family life. And then, quite often, he'll take another 2 to 4 weeks when she goes back to work later on. So what I'd like to achieve is something that maximises the choice and flexibility for family life. I think, though, there is also a big issue at the end of year one, because I think we have been talking a lot about first year of life, and there's a lot of important stuff there about family bonding, about the long-term stability and life chances for the children in those families. But there is then a horrible gap between the end of year one and when school starts. And the CBI, I think, has done some really good work looking at how do you fill the gap. And what is the benefit to the country of properly paying for childcare? But I would say it isn't just about having childcare in place so that both mother and fathers can be back at full-time work as soon as their baby turns 1 year old. That is not the family life I don't think that anyone's looking at, because if you go back to the evidence of the Modern Families Index and the evidence of all the work that Tina's doing, you see that the time currency is so valuable. We did some research a few years ago with the relationships research charity 1+1, where we looked at the impact on couple relationships of work, and we could show that where work is impacting negatively, then that goes back into the home and is destructive. It can be reversed. But we have to recognise the cost to the UK of making people, not making, but driving people to a position where both members of a couple feel that they have to work full-time. I think we need a cultural change so that we get to a place where it is natural for fathers and mothers to be working less than full-time until their children are however old. And that would reduce childcare costs.
That also links into other caring costs, though, and that's the whole thing about if fathers are involved from the beginning, the whole idea that men can care too. They might not do it in the way that their wives or partners want them to do it. They do it slightly differently. You might recognise that, but and it might work the talk about getting it wrong.
Much better.
For example.
Much
so,
better.
but that because we also don't want the idea of women doing all the elder care as well. That is, actually we've got to. This is a broader cultural shift that we require in terms of caring being a human activity, a resource that we all have, and we will achieve it in different ways. But I think we really signal something so important in that first year about men's capacities to care, and that is something that they will, they can do very competently, more competently than some mothers, and not naming anyone there, but take that on into later life, into caring responsibilities, which we know is a growing area and a growing policy concern and a cost and all of those things, which also ties into the flexible working that is required, not just in this first year, but families need to be able to organise and care for the family in a very broadly conceived way.
Thank you very much for that. And can I just come back to you, Edward? In particular, the Centre for Social Justice's recommendation that we need to look to father-proof workplaces. Are you able to just tell us a little bit more about what that means in reality? And do you think that that's something that we can expect to see in every single workplace?
I mean, some of this comes back to our recommendation on the Equality Act, which is, in some ways, can feel like a bit of a sledgehammer, but particularly if you are in vulnerable employment, you need something legislative, something you can hold on to. So again, it's designing something not for the middle-class lawyer who probably feels empowered enough to say, I want some leave, I'm entitled to this. It's having something in place where you can say, do you know what, the law says I can do this and you can't sack me for it. And so if you are in vulnerable employment, if you are in a difficult place, if you are not a high earner, what can we put in place to say, actually, this is important for me too? And so it is that legislative side, I think, that is really important.
And quite specifically, what do you think those legislative things, in terms of a workplace that is happy and can accommodate those requests from fathers, what do you think those specifics should be in terms of...
Yeah, I mean, the Equality Act is the one we put here, and the first thing we put in our submission is that actually we don't actually really know, particularly for people in vulnerable employment, what that is. In that a lot of this so far has focused on people in slightly higher earning, slightly more secure jobs, looking at flexibility and that sort of thing, whereas actually we're not quite sure. We think there needs to be a lot more research into people. If you're working on an assembly line and it starts at 9 a.m. and it finishes at 5, you can't not be there. So what does that look like? And I don't think there's enough thought and enough research essentially into what it could look like for people like that. And again, so I'll come back to this, it's a cultural thing as well. That there won't be much thought into that because culturally it's not valued in that environment. So why would we look at that? And so having government legislate for this, having government put someone senior right at the top and say this matters, will actually be the only way that you'll see things like that actually changing.
I mean, perhaps to give you an example, I recently met with women from West Yorkshire Police about some of the pressures on them and balancing childcare and one thing and another. And one of the points that they raised was whether it was women or whether it was their partners, where there are specific specialist roles like firearms deployment, for example, the pressures there were that actually these are specialist jobs, and so any scope for flexibility and parental care with that bit more reduced in certain roles. Do you think that there is do you think that it's still acceptable to say that we need to look to accommodate these requests within those jobs, or is it acceptable to say that these certain jobs it just can't be done?
Yeah, I mean there's going to be jobs you can't, if there's a fire and the bell goes, you've got to go. I think absolutely that there has to be an element of that. But I think it's that shifting of culture, it's that changing the mentality of employers where there could be scope, but it's not a priority. Where culturally for 4,000 years I haven't had to think about this, employing this guy, because actually there've been these really gender-defined roles, and suddenly just in the last 20 years, an employer, am I being made to think about this? And so, yeah, absolutely, there will be moments when you've got to do the job. But too often I think it's a skew towards, I'm going to make you do this job because historically this is how we treat you in the workplace. And you see it in little subtle ways as well. I think sort of the way that people react to a father who goes and picks up their child as well. You see just little comments like, oh, he's off on the run again, that you would never dream of saying to a mother who is doing that, because they have that sort of protected identity a bit more in the workplace, because they have fought for that for the last 50 years, and no one has quite fought for the fathers in the same way.
You make a really interesting...
Sarah, I just wanted to chip in on the are the jobs where family can't be accommodated, to say that that's more of a yes and a no. I mean, what we're seeing is organisations who you would not expect to be thinking about it are thinking about it, and it's actually about honesty and managing expectations. So, you know, the women in the West Yorkshire Police were quite clear that firearms officers, there are things you have to do. Where people run into trouble is where an employee just assumes that flexible working means they can have flexible working. Where it works is where an employer thinks very clearly and carefully about the design of the role. So organisations as unlikely, if you like, as the RAF and BAE naval ships, who are they're shipbuilders, are looking at ways of supporting family life. And they're doing it by being honest about the limitations and the constraints. So I think it's just really important not to slip into a sense that there are no jobs, that every job is, or there are some jobs that can never be flexed or family friendly.
And perhaps just further to the point that you made, Edward, around culture, because that's a really interesting element of this, that sometimes it's perhaps not about the role that government plays or employers play, but are there pressures that are more about social attitudes or cultural norms that are really weighing heavy on that decision making around parental care and the role of fathers? Have you got evidence perhaps from your hotline of that, Sarah, of different cultural pressures?
I think the evidence we have is that fathers are, for example, the 25% of fathers who ask us about benefits and finances, they don't talk about childcare. It's absolutely striking that childcare costs are not something that they present with. So that tells us something culturally. I think it's also clear that they're struggling with no, post-changes is the same actually, but it's this lack of understanding about how they can use emergency leave or parental leave. They're very much stuck in an assumption that flexible working is the only way, and if they're being told no, there's no alternatives. So I think yes is the answer, that they are making assumptions, and I think also not from the helpline, but thinking again about the focus groups in Scotland last year. Their couples were very clear that what they wanted to do was look after their kids themselves. And fathers would often say, I'd like to, but she earns less than me, I earn more, I've got the steady job, I'm the one who should give up the fathering. So.
Thank you.
Sorry, if I can add one more thing. It's really employer specific at times as well, like it's job specific. So thinking of other work we do at the CSJ, last week we released something on housing for military families, and deploying soldiers is again, it's not something you can opt out of, but actually the way you can support families is by looking at their housing and looking at the support they get on the base and things like that. And that's, that doesn't apply to a gas fitter, that doesn't apply to someone that works at a think tank, but having the employer think about family stuff and what it means in that context is the really important thing.
I think Ben wanted to come in with a supplementary. Is that all right?
Yeah. You provided some really interesting evidence in relation to the social and attitudinal barriers that are in place, but ask a different question in a different way, because I can sense where you're coming from in terms of the most effective ways in order to tackle some of these attitudinal social barriers. But actually, specifically, what do you think is the low-hanging fruit in this on this issue? What would you think is the most effective way to tackle these barriers in a short, sharp way?
One which comes up is a really basic one, is that if you want to engage dads, the one time they have to engage with the state on becoming dads is at antenatal appointments. And the Department of Health, for very, very good reasons, isn't really interested in dads because it's interested in making sure the mum and baby are safe. But it means that historically, I think someone mentioned earlier that there was one dad who was even looked at and spoken to at an antenatal appointment. It meant so much to them. And I'd so taken my CSJ hat off for a second. I volunteered for a dad's charity for the last 8 or 9 years, and we do antenatal classes in hospital. We just go to these places and we say, right, we're going to do a dad's only course, and we're just going to talk about your issues and what you want to talk about. And this is, we sort of do that because this is the only place that they will have to interact at some point, and so this is the point where we target. But even then, we are entirely dependent on the goodwill of midwives to let us into the hospital. So, we have 3 or 4 hospitals where we have good relationships where the midwives say, do you know what, this is a good thing. And it's the right spot to do it because they're there, they're willing, they're desperate for information, and yet it's not quite set up. It's not a priority, it's not something they have to do, it's not something that they're funded to do, and so it slips by. And that feels like somewhere actually it wouldn't even cost much. I mean, there are people doing this for free all over the place, where you could say, can you just make sure that every dad turns up to an antenatal appointment? Can you make sure that you just talk to them at some point, address them, acknowledge they're in the room and that their role is important? And I think that is a sort of Department of Health thing that could be done really easily, wouldn't cost much, and just engage them at this point.
But also, before I ask other people, I mean, it might also have an impact in relation to postnatal depression and the safety of men as well, which is really not talked about.
The courses I do, postnatal depression comes up every single time in mums and dads, and it's totally unspoken about. But, you know, suicide's the biggest killer of men under 50 now. Why are we not doing something about that? So, yeah.
I completely concur with that. I spent the last 20 years developing information services, working with maternity services. I'm now taking it internationally to Africa and the Middle East, and that is the key. I mean, in terms of low-hanging fruit, the key moment of where fathers and institutions connect is around the birth, and that is a maximum opportunity. It's very complicated because it doesn't quite fit the NHS system.